been a great whirlwind tour of Birmingham, and I've really got a better sense of what this great institution is about, and the potential for this city, and particularly the core of the city, to flourish and thrive in ways that I think may not even be completely imaginable today, because of, as you'll see, some radical change in market dynamics and demographic shifts in the United States and elsewhere. So let me give this presentation, then more importantly, really engage in an interactive way. So, what the Metropolitan Revolution was about is a sense that the US is in the middle of a pivotal decade. That's partly because of just the economic conditions of the country post-Great Recession. Incredibly, we still need to grow about 3.2 million jobs in the United States to make up jobs we lost during the Great Recession and to keep pace with population growth. We made up the private sector jobs. We really haven't made up the public sector jobs we lost. But the real important piece here, particularly for cities and metropolitan areas like Birmingham, is that we need to grow better jobs. I mean, we saw a quantum leap in the number of people living in poverty and near poverty from 2000 to 2011. That was the recession. It was also the collapse and the hemorrhaging of our manufacturing sector in the United States. So it's not that complicated at, sort of a abstract scale to sort of talk about what we need to do. We need to change the growth model in the United States from one pre-recession that was focused on consumption and debt and frankly an enormous amount of financial mischief to one that gets back to fundamentals. An economy that is fueled by innovation and by production and by focusing on making quality products and providing quality service, yes, for the United States, but for the global market, and for really being open and welcoming to immigration. In theory, you might want to have a national government to help guide and steer the change in your growth model. Well, the federal government has essentially left the building, sometimes literally have left the building. But the more important thing, I think, for everyone in this room to recognize is that we're experiencing a structural shift in what our national government does because of the aging of our society. And what we're going to see over the next decade is the federal government will essentially become a health insurance company with an army. More and more of the resources will be spent on Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security. And the threat here is that it's going to crowd out and squeeze down investments in everything else, which includes, most importantly for this institution and for this city, investments in research and development, basic science. So the Metropolitan Revolution really is about cities and metropolitan areas receiving the memo, so to speak, from the national government, and states, frankly, come in and out of consciousness, and stepping up, not just as city governments, but public, private, civic, community leaders to restructure their economies and get about the business of growing more and better jobs. Now, we have about 388 metropolitan areas in the United States. You're the 49th largest. You're in the top 50, and I'll keep coming back to that because it's really important to think about yourself as one of the top 50 metropolitan areas in what is still the preeminent economy in the world. The top 100 alone sit on only an eighth of our landmass, they're 2/3 of our population, they're 3/4 of our GDP, but on everything that matters to the progress and the prosperity of this nation, they're at 75, 80, 85, 90% of the nation's share. We are still the preeminent economy in the world because we're a metropolitan nation. And frankly, the rise of China and the rise of India and the rise of African nations is because they are becoming like us. They are beginning to concentrate and agglomerate their assets in relatively small geographies that we call cities and metropolitan areas. Now, given the collapse of the national government and the drift of states, what we're seeing by cities and metropolitan areas is they're recognizing the changing market dynamics of the 21st century, which revalues proximity and density and authenticity and vibrancy. So why don't you listen to this?
The geography of innovation is shifting. To find the innovative economy 20 years ago, a worker needed to drive to a secluded research park, work in isolation, and keep ideas secret. Today, proximity is everything. Workers want to be in urban places that are walkable, bikeable, hyper-caffeinated, where they can bump into other workers and share ideas. Firms also want to be close to other firms, research labs, and universities in collaborative spaces so that smart ideas can be turned into smart products for the market. Innovation districts are this century's productive geography. They are both competitive places and cool spaces, and they will transform your city and metropolis.
Birmingham, right? That's what I just described. This is our definition of innovation districts. It's essentially what you have here. You have a major anchor institutions. Actually, you have a network of major research institutions. You have startups and entrepreneurs and a whole suite of companies and investors that basically want to be in the shadow of the research institutions because you've got quality students and quality faculty, and you're basically creating ideas that can turn into discoveries for the market, and it's all in an urban setting, right? We went by Innovation Depot yesterday, Railroad Park, a sort of walk to the coffee bars. I think I'm on about my 5th today. Basically live on caffeine. This is what the market wants. It wants the platform for innovation now not 30 miles out in a closed science park or research park, but in cities, right? Because of walkability, livability, bikeability, and the collisions that can happen between people within disciplines and across disciplines. When we look across the United States, we see 3 models emerging. The Anchor Plus model is essentially what you all have. This is an anchor around which companies want to be. In some hot markets like Seattle or San Francisco or Boston or New York, the real estate prices are so high that you basically have to jump out from, let's say, Kendall Square in Cambridge, where MIT is, to the Boston seaport so that you can find the space, the creative space, the co-working space for companies. And if we went to Raleigh-Durham today, I mean, you'd really see, I think, the validation of this new spatial geography, because you can go to Research Triangle Park, really the iconic research park in the United States, 7,000 acres. They are urbanizing 500 acres. They're putting in housing, they're putting in retail, they're putting in walking paths and biking paths, because companies want to be in an urban setting. And if they, they'd rather be in downtown Durham than potentially in RTP. So this is the new geography of innovation for the 21st century. And in the book, we talked about several stories of places that were beginning to get this and beginning to change how they act, not just as local government, but local government, university, civic, and business leaders. So let's just talk about New York for a second. New York, if you went to the city and asked Mike Bloomberg in 2005, what's your economic development strategy? His response would have been, we're going to subsidize 2 stadia on the west side of Manhattan so we can compete with London for the 2012 Olympics. How much beer and hot dogs can you sell, basically, is the question. But when the recession hit, Bloomberg and his team radically changed their economic development strategy. They basically understood that they needed to diversify the New York economy away from finance and towards essentially the STEM economy, science, technology, engineering, and math. And so they basically went out to build a network of applied science institutes. And they put a request for proposal to the world, ultimately Stanford, Cornell Technion, a whole bunch of other great world-beating engineering and computer science institutions competed. They ultimately brought Cornell Technion to Roosevelt Island, And they also worked with Columbia and NYU and other universities within the city to build out other applied sciences. The city put about $130 million of capital budgets, of their capital budget, into remaking Roosevelt Island for Cornell and Technion. About $2 billion in private capital is already invested to build out the facility. And the growth projections, from my perspective, are actually fairly low in terms of what can be expected over the next several decades in terms of investment, but also in terms of job growth. Listen to the former deputy mayor talk about this.
As you look at the economy in New York, we have a lot of strengths, but it's clear everywhere in industry that technology is disrupting business models. And so while applied science and engineering can help startup companies, it's also required for the key industries that are already here.
These great institutions that have made a commitment to come to New York, not in an ivory tower tradition, but to partner with industry, to partner with the corporate community, to really design the next generation of whole industries.
It really is a momentum that has fed upon itself. You've seen the reality on the ground change, and as the reality on the ground has changed, I think the ambition of the various universities in turn has continued to ratchet up. And this is a virtuous cycle that we hope continues for many, many years into the future.
So New York understands that 21st century economic development starts with advanced research and applied sciences. That's the platform for innovative growth. Let's go to Detroit, because I think Detroit has a different story to tell, and one which is very relevant to this. And Detroit, everyone thinks of Detroit as an absolute basket case because of the bankruptcy. Actually, if you want to feel really good about this country, go spend a couple days in Detroit, because the esprit de corps, the level of commitment of business, civic, political, university, community leaders is second to none in this country. What Detroit realized, like in many respects is that even though Detroit is very large, it's about 138 square miles, it's the small piece in the core where the bulk of the jobs are located. So this is the downtown and the midtown of Detroit. It sits along the Detroit River. Canada actually sits to the south. It's only about 3% of the landmass, about 11% of the business, and actually our latest calculation is close to 50% of the jobs. In a very relatively small geography. And that's the way the US rolls, essentially. We have these cities that have these cores that have the bulk of the jobs and actually the bulk of the innovative jobs. Let's just look at this with a little more specificity, because, and think about Birmingham from this perspective. The downtown and the midtown, they have all the assets, right? I mean, in Detroit, you've got Wayne State University, you've got the Detroit Medical Campus, you've got Henry Ford Health, College for Creative Studies, great design school, you've got small batch manufacturing now happening with Shinola. You go into the downtown, that's where you have a lot of the old, great architectural building, in many respects like you have, built in the 20s, built in the 30s, good bones, good stuff, street grid, baseball, football stadium, like you all have, right? This is the core, not just of the city, but of the region. And they're building an M1 rail to connect the downtown to the midtown, locally financed, for the most part. Private families, philanthropies. The federal government came in at the end in a $125 million deal. They put $25 million in at the end. But this is locally financed transit to basically be the spine of a big innovation district. Listen to the former economic development director talk about this.
The density that we were trying to create was to put more feet on the street, as I put it, and not just between 9 to 5, but around the clock, 24/7, to create an exciting urban environment.
How do you best do that? You do it by creating a built environment that really is dense and that sort of forces folks to come together every day, whether it's walking across the campus or whether it's stopping into your local bakery.
You're at Starbucks and you have the opportunity to bounce into somebody who's working on something related, or you're out in the evening and you're having a drink and you're talking to somebody. It's that intersection of ideas and energy that really makes a city powerful. And we needed that here in our region, and we need to do it in a confined area so that it's not sort of lost through diffusion.
Detroit's really no different from this region. It decentralized its economy. It was hyper-segregated by race and by class, right? But the market and demographic shifts are revaluing these small parts of the cores of cities. I mean, this is what companies want. This is what workers want, not uniformly, but increasingly, because of big structural forces. So how do you build on this? Because I think, you know, the purpose of my visit, frankly, and this is Max's genius with others, is not just to give a talk, but really hopefully be a catalyst for smart public, private, and civic action. The first is to recognize that cities are not governments. The federal government is a government. Therefore, it can be hijacked by partisanship. It has been. States are governments. They're really just artificial political units. They can be hijacked by partisanship. They have been. Cities are networks. They're not governments. And what cities reward is pragmatic action across corporate, civic, community, and university leaders. The way in which networks are created and stewarded changes. In New York, you know, Mike Bloomberg, one of the wealthiest people in the room, if he calls you and says, I need you at a meeting, you show up, right? So a couple hundred people showed up, business leaders, university leaders, community leaders, and the charge to them was, we're the epicenter of a global recession. We need to diversify our economy. We're not building more stadia. What do we do? That's where applied sciences came from, okay? Detroit is really, you know, one billionaire, Dan Gilbert, owns Quicken Loans, owns the Cleveland Cavaliers. He buys downtown Detroit, right? It was fairly cheap. Good real estate deal, right? Method in the madness. But then others, Wayne State, Henry Ford Health, I mean, you know, institutions like UAB or Southern Research, then also are part of a network with philanthropies to basically understand their competitive advantage in a global marketplace and leverage it. And finally, Houston, which is a great story about immigrant integration, is really about a network of 21st century settlement houses. So as we're building these innovation hubs, there are intermediaries and institutions that can connect, whether it's immigrants or other neighborhoods, other people who've been left out of the economy, to this engine. Because a lot of the jobs in these areas are not just for people with graduate degrees or four-year degrees, but they're for folks with skills. And you can get those skills in high school or you can get them in community colleges. So networks are formed in different ways. The next piece is what's your vision? And that's to understand what's unique about your place. I mean, Denver is a very different economy than Detroit. You know, Pittsburgh is different than Phoenix or Portland. Birmingham is different than Boston or Baltimore. I mean, this is a country of variegated metropolitan economies. And innovation districts, to a large extent, reflect their metropolitan economies. They're just like the hub of it, you know, and the cockpit of these metropolitan economies. So this is to follow the great advice of Dolly Parton. Figure out who you are and do it on purpose, right? God knows what Dolly Parton was talking about, but that's great regional economic development theory. So in different parts of the country, what you're seeing in New York was the recognition we're too dependent in finance, and we don't have enough STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, in our system. Answer, applied sciences. In Detroit, double down, quadruple down on this core of the city, you know, because you could focus on all 138 square miles. There are not enough resources in the city of Detroit, Detroit Metro, or the state of Michigan to basically deal with 138 square miles. But 3% of the land mass, yeah, you can get your arms around that stuff. And that becomes the radiating multiplier effect for urban revival. And in Houston just understood that it's America on fast forward. It's becoming a majority minority. It already is a majority minority metropolis. We're going to have to change our language in the US to reflect that. And it's understanding that immigrants and others in the community have huge talents that have just not been tapped and need to be connected into this innovation economy. The last piece is define your game changer. And innovation districts are a game changer because it is the path for the growth of high-value companies, for the growth of good and better jobs, for the growth of tax revenues, for bringing a large number of people and neighborhoods along for the ride. I mean, this is the market basically telling cities, you may have been ignored or undermined in the 1970s and the 1980s as we build out our freeways and basically subsidize sprawl. But now, this is the time to recognize the value of density and the value of authenticity and vibrancy and vitality. So in places like New York, what they're doing is they're trying to set an institutional platform for that kind of innovative growth. Because, Columbia is a great university and NYU is a great university, but they didn't really have that mix of engineering and computer science talent that you need. In Detroit, a lot of this is about cityness at the end of the day. I mean, they have anchor institutions, they have a level of research. You have more of it actually here with UAB and Southern Research, but they have a platform. What they don't have is what we like about cities. There really wasn't walking, biking, transit. Well, they're bringing that, as you heard from the video. They're bringing that back into the city. And it's an incredible amount of investment that's going in, initially from the local capital, but now is attracting international capital from all over the world because, it's the great American way. You can buy cheap and sell high, right? And so very interesting stories. And in Houston, it's to recognize that innovation and inclusion go together. The innovative economy can be a pathway for people who've been really left out of the U.S. economy to sort of, with a bit of skilling, whether it's about coding or something, a bit of skilling can get into the middle of this for their families and for their communities. So let me just bring this back to the Metropolitan Revolution, because what I've primarily described is an economic dynamic and a demographic dynamic that cities can harness public, private, civic, university, community, and push forward. But there's a political story here, because for the next decade or beyond, we're going to live in a country where the national government is on a frolic and a detour, and the states are pretty much out to lunch. So just think about if this city and the other top 50 cities in the country and the top 100 cities began to really, with purpose and intention, build out their economies.
From an early age, we are taught how our nation is supposed to work. The president, vice president, and members of Congress sit at the top. Governors and legislators run their states. The rest of us take our cues from them. While states and the federal government may be part of the Constitution, our population and economic power is actually concentrated in our metropolitan areas. It's time to rethink power in America. In this century, metros will lead and states and the federal government will follow. In cities and metros, public, private, and civic leaders are helping workers get the skills they need, investing in infrastructure and growing jobs through expanded trade and investment, the hard work necessary to renew our economy.
So the next time you watch the Donald or Hillary or anyone else, don't be fooled that they run the country. You run the country. Corporate, civic, political, university, community leaders at this level are basically at the vanguard of progress and prosperity in the United States. In some ways, it may have always been like that. It is definitely like that today, and frankly, on into the foreseeable future.